today's session, I want to take a few minutes and talk about the barriers to instituting an inclusive program for students with some type of learning disability. Now, oftentimes when we think about starting a program that is inclusive, the first thing that happens is that people start thinking about why we can't do a program like this. People automatically jump to funding. People say, well, we can't have a program like this because funding. Funding is not there. We can't add this to the budget. This would take so much to do. Now, the question is that real? Well, the reality is, in many cases, that can be a barrier to having a fully developed program, but it should not stop a school from at least beginning the process and looking at additional sources of revenue to be able to institute an inclusive program. But what that automatically assumes is that the school has done its homework in establishing what are the financial needs of the school to begin a program that is inclusive. So that's the very first thing that people automatically say. It's funding, we can't do it. But there are ways around it. And we'll talk about that later throughout this course. Now, another barrier that often comes up is the lack of training on the part of both teachers and administrators. Teachers say, well, I really don't have the expertise to be able to help these students. I don't understand what their disability is. I do not understand how I can specifically help them. So there's automatically a pushback to say, people aren't trained, we don't know enough, we can't possibly think about this. And it also goes to the point that many administrators are not trained in how to develop an inclusive program. So that is a very real barrier, but it can be overcome. There are so many resources that are out there to support teachers and administrators. Now, another barrier that often comes up is poor collaboration within the school. People look at it as, this is my classroom, this is my world, and if I start varying from that, then that's just too much for me to do. And people look at it as it's all about me, as opposed to what I can do as a teacher to make sure that I learn from others and learn from best practices, not only in your school, but in other institutions. And the resources are out there. Another barrier that I've heard over and over again is that, well, if we have an inclusive program, that means we're just going to lower the bar. We're just going to basically lower the expectations for our students. If you are doing that, then you have missed the point of what inclusive education is supposed to be. It is about providing students with opportunities, regardless of their levels. Now, again, when we start lowering the bar, then you have a lot of parents looking at the school and saying, well, wait a minute, my child needs this and you're trying to go to the lowest possible denominator. This is negatively impacting my child. So that's a very real barrier that can and should be overcome by sitting down and talking to one another. People in the school need to talk, again, amongst teachers as well as parents and administrators, parents and students, parents and teachers, to understand what the expectations are and how we can help our students achieve those. Now, another problem is misinformation. In today's world, misinformation is everywhere. We talk about the negatives before we even understand the real issue. So misinformation. And along with that is misdiagnosis. How do we diagnose the learning disability that the child has? How do we engage with parents and outside specialists to ensure that we understand what the student is capable of doing? Now, another one that always comes up is physical barriers. We can't have an inclusive program because of the fact that we just don't have the facilities. Now, one of the things that I would say is I would encourage every administrator to look at ADA. If your school is not in compliance with ADA, then I strongly suggest that your school take a hard look at what needs to be done and make sure that you find the funding to do those ASAP. Because that same thing occurs if you have a parent that's in a wheelchair and you say, well, I'm sorry, we can't really talk to you because we don't have any ramps. We don't have restroom facilities for you if you need them. What we need to do is make sure that all of our facilities are compliant with ADA so that we reduce those physical barriers that we oftentimes develop. Another barrier that often comes up is inappropriate curriculum. And this ties in with, again, the low expectations. People say, well, we have to have a special curriculum for these children. Not necessarily. If we have an inclusive environment, we want these students to learn about history, math, whatever it would be. Now, the level of their cognition might be different, and they might not be able to finish all of the readings, but we've got to make sure that we have an appropriate curriculum. So again, we have to look at the curriculum when we're talking about inclusive programs. We have to look at policies. What are your school's policies? Now, in terms of the public school settings, those are established by both the local county and your state Department of Education. Now, in private schools, it's a little bit different, because private schools are not required to admit every student. So if you're in a private school and you want your school to begin to have an inclusive program of education, you need to look at your policies, and it starts with admissions and establishing what can you do and what can't you do. Another one is the negative attitudes. People look, that's just too much work. Why are we even doing that? Let them go to the public schools. And the public school teachers are saying, well, that's fine. We'll do that. But at the same time, even in public schools, there is oftentimes a negative reaction from teachers because they're saying, why do I have to do all these things? Why do I have to do an IEP? Why do I have to do all this? I want to be a teacher. I'm not a special ed teacher. Why do I have to do that? So we've got to overcome those negative attitudes. And that starts with the training and dialogue between the faculty, the administration, about what is the vision for your school. Oftentimes people say, well, again, we don't have the facilities or we don't have assistive technology. We don't really have all of that. And again, what I often find is when I ask people the question of, well, what does assistive technology mean? Well, it means kind of, sort of, and people don't understand that most of the technology that we have in our schools can be utilized as part of assistive technology. But again, it takes coordination and it takes communication. Now that we've talked about the barriers, how do we overcome those barriers? Well, there are several things we can do. And it first and foremost starts with the leadership. The leadership in the school. They have to make sure that everyone understands the mission of the school and the vision for what education should be like in their particular school. It also means that you have to ensure that the attitudes and the beliefs about the importance of an inclusive educational system are present in your faculty and your staff. You also need to make sure that there is appropriate training for administrators, teachers, and support staff to ensure that they understand how they can be the most helpful in developing an educational program that fits the needs of the wide variety of students in their classrooms. The school also needs to make sure that they establish the funding, the resources to be able to do what needs to be done. That means capital resources as well as human resources. Perhaps you need to hire some additional personnel, and we'll discuss that later in this course. We need to look at establishing a school that mirrors what education in the 21st century should be, and that is an education for all students, meeting the needs of the students and helping them grow, helping them develop so that they can be useful, productive, energetic participants in society. That's what we're trying to do with inclusive education. As always, if you have any questions or comments for me, please don't hesitate to let me know. I appreciate it and have a great day.